Diana Zuckerman, who is the president of the National Center for Health Research and the Cancer Prevention and Treatment Fund.
Thanks very much. And I want to start out by saying that I thought the vision that you have for the center is terrific. Of course, the devil's always in the details. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the concerns that we have about some of the issues at FDA more generally, not just in devices, but the whole focus on speeding up approvals and what the implications are for patients and how patients' voices are being heard, or whether only some patients' voices are being heard. I think just generally to say that in the abstract, patients have a certain tolerance for risk, which changes dramatically when something bad happens to them when they're taking a product. So I'm going to first talk about drug approvals because I think many of you are more familiar with that, and then compare the standards with device approvals. So the standards, the general standard for FDA drug approval over the years developed into 2 clinical trials, often thousands of patients, certainly hundreds of patients, but also focused on short-term safety, usually a few months, maybe a year or 2 at the most. But much more likely to be a year or less, even for drugs like cholesterol-lowering drugs that you might take for decades. The effectiveness, usually compared to placebo, but certainly the gold standard, it has been double-blind clinical trials using a health outcome. By a health outcome, I mean something that actually influences your health, whether it's survival or fewer days of hospitalization or some other kind of health measure that matters to you. And the other thing about FDA drug approvals, and this is true really for pretty much all traditionally reviewed prescription drugs, is that they can be inspected, that the manufacturer that makes them will be inspected prior to sale so that they'll know whether the drug's actually being made the way it's supposed to be made, because sometimes it isn't, or it might be contaminated or something else. Now, frequently over the last few years, there have been more and more new pathways for drugs that have involved faster drug approvals that have many different names. There's fast track, there's breakthrough, there's expedited. I won't get into all the different types. There's, I think, 6 now. But there was a study recently published of new drugs approved, what's called the class of 2008. New drugs approved in 2008, and they intentionally picked that year so that they could see what happened since then. And they looked at the ones that went through various fast tracks versus those that went through the traditional standard. For the fast tracks, generally there'd be 1 clinical trial instead of 2. The median in terms of the number of patients was 100 patients instead of 580 patients in the other ones. That, of course, can mean fewer women, fewer people of color, and almost always not enough women or people of color to analyze separately. So you mush them all together and you say this drug seems to work, but maybe it works for men and not women, or women and not men, or white women but not women of color. There are various reasons to be concerned because drugs are metabolized differently by different groups. And then the faster drug approvals often are, although not always, but often based on a surrogate endpoint or a biomarker. That means you might be, for example, looking at glucose levels for a diabetes drug, but not look at the actual health of diabetes patients. Now, we all know that glucose levels are important, but that doesn't mean that they always correlate with health. And in fact, a recent study showed that often people are getting hypoglycemic, their glucose levels are too low, and that they're hospitalized and more likely to die from having sugar levels that are too low rather than too high, which was certainly surprising and not expected. For cancer, it's often a surrogate endpoint might be progression-free survival, which you think would predict whether a person dies or not. But what they have found, for example, with Avastin for breast cancer, is that in the preliminary studies, the women, their cancer seemed to be stopped and it was less likely to progress, and it was a slower progression by several months. But when they did the longer-term studies, they found that the women were actually slightly, although not significantly, more likely to die sooner and with worse quality of life. The faster drug approvals, the good news was that they did get to the market about 2 years faster. And they did rely more on post-market studies, which were supposed to be larger and longer term. But what they found for the class of 2008 was that 5 years later, less than a third of the post-market studies had been completed. So, maybe that's because the studies were 5-year studies. It varies, but it does tell you that it takes quite a long time to get that data. So if the product's been approved more quickly on the basis of less information, it could be many, many years before you have the information you need to know how good the product is. Certainly with Avastin, I think Annette could probably tell me, but I think it was 10 years or more before they realized that this drug was not actually helping patients. Now, for medical devices, it's quite a different standard, and I will go through this quickly because unlike prescription drugs, medical devices are classified into different classifications. The low-risk devices are not usually tested at all. The medium to high-risk devices are tested in terms of substantial equivalence to a device already on the market, and the highest risk devices are subject to clinical trials and to inspections and possibly post-market studies. And I'll give you some examples of these products. So I was going to ask how many people have ever used medical devices, and I forgot to ask you, but if you've ever had a Band-Aid, you have. And so crutches and Band-Aids and tongue depressors and many other things are not required to have data. The moderate risk devices used to be called moderate risk. Actually, now they're called moderate to high risk, that go through the 510(k) process, involve a wide range of different kinds of devices. It includes contact lenses as well as contact lens solution. It includes a glucose meter. It includes hip implants as well as knee implants, shoulder implants, ankle implants, quite a lot of other implants, including some heart valves. And it includes something like the inferior vena cava filter, which filters out blood clots and is obviously a life-saving device. And then the highest risk medical devices that do go through a process more similar to the one for prescription drugs include things like a pacemaker, an artificial heart, an infusion pump. There are many other devices in there that are clearly life-saving, but as I mentioned, some of the ones that are going through the 510(k) process can also be life-saving or life-sustaining, and certainly can be implants. So the pre-market approval process for the highest risk devices, they must prove that they're reasonably safe and reasonably effective, and that's based usually on one clinical trial. And according to a study published recently, about 27% of those clinical trials are randomized. About 14% are either single-blind or double-blind studies. About 40% have any kind of active control group, and on average, they have about 308 patients. That's the median. So, and some of those studies really are closer to 100 patients. There's a lot of reasons not to have a double-blind clinical trial of an implant. When I got my hip implant, I certainly would have been unhappy to find out that they didn't actually put the implant in. They just did surgery but didn't actually do anything. So, there are reasons for not having double-blind clinical trials, and in some cases for not having single-blind. But I'm not sure how enthusiastic most public health experts would be about not having any active control group for the majority of the studies. It's also important to know that when changes are made to these 1% of the highest risk devices that go through the PMA process, if the company wants to make changes in that device after it's already been approved, often the companies do have to submit information, an application to the FDA, but they often do not have to do any clinical trials on the revised version of the device. And in numerous cases that we've looked at where there are long-term post-market studies required, we've seen situations where half or more than half of the patients are lost to follow-up, and yet there's no penalty to the company. And in many cases, the data does not seem particularly worthwhile, but there's no enforcement of that requirement of doing the post-market study as had been agreed to. Another problem with long-term post-market studies is that so often these devices are changed over a period of time. So even after a year or 2 or 3, the company might be tinkering with that device. By the time your 5-year post-market study's done, the device that was being studied may no longer be for sale in exactly the same format that it was being studied in. So you don't know, as a new patient, whether that's a good device for you or not, although you might know if you've got it, it wasn't such a good idea or it was. The FDA just recently, as Bill pointed out, has proposed an expedited pathway for these 1% of most of the riskiest medical devices, and judging from what happened to the standards for drugs, we're very concerned at our center, and some members of the Patient, Consumer, and Public Health Coalition in this group, very concerned about if you take standards that are already lower than the ones for drugs and you lower them further, what does that give you? So if we've already got 27% randomized and less than 40% controlled clinical trials, sometimes with less than 100 patients, how do you speed up that process and make it less burdensome for device companies by lowering the standards further? And when you lower that burden for the device companies, for the studies they have to do, how does that raise the burden for patients and physicians? Because we have to make decisions. Do we want this device? And we're making it on increasingly, potentially less information. So with approximately 98% of devices that are regulated by the FDA reviewed as a 510K through the process, usually moderate or high risk, the Institute of Medicine pointed out that those 510K devices, many of them implants, are not tested for safety or efficacy. As I mentioned earlier, they're just tested to see if they're substantially equivalent to other devices legally on the market. They almost never have clinical trials. They do not have pre-market inspections to make sure they're being made the way they're supposed to be made. And the law says that the FDA cannot require post-market studies as a condition of approval. After the device is on the market, then if there's a problem, the FDA can ask for post-market studies, as happened with metal-on-metal hip implants. For substantial equivalence, what does that mean? It's supposed to have a similar purpose. The device should have a similar purpose, usually or traditionally made out of a similar material or a similar mechanism of action. The good news for consumers is that about 90% of these are reviewed within 90 days, and according to the GAO, about 90% are approved. So a lot of these are being approved, and the question is, how good is the evidence, and how do you feel about having an implant in your body, for example, that's never been required to be tested in clinical trials? I think everybody here, since we're an evidence-based group, knows that the good thing about clinical trials is that can provide evidence of risks that may be unforeseen. And that would especially be true of products made out of different implants made out of different materials or used differently. And you want also clinical trials to prove that a product is effective. And how do you feel about having a medical device that might be life-sustaining or life-saving that wasn't scientifically tested on humans or animals, but instead were tested in bioengineering studies? Our center did a study that found that the vast majority of the 113 million devices that were high-risk recalls in a 5-year period were 510K devices. That's what that large thing is in the middle. In a recent year, 500 million 510K devices were recalled as high risk in 1 year, including contaminated alcohol swabs that killed this little boy. I think it's time to end. We also just finished a study looking at the scientific evidence that's available to the public about 510K medical implants, only looking at implants, not other devices. And that's pretty hard to read, but just look at those dark slivers. That's the number, looking at over 1,000 implants, that's the percentage where there was clear data available. Sometimes clinical data, the smaller sliver, and other times non-clinical data, the more purple sliver, where actual data were provided and available to the public to see why this implant was considered substantially equivalent to one already on the market. So if we want to ensure safety, I think clinical trials are really important. Design flaws could be caught by clinical trials. Manufacturing flaws could be caught by either inspections or clinical trials, and any flaws can be caught sooner with post-market studies, registries, as Dr. Maisel mentioned, and post-market surveillance. Long-term post-market studies are extremely important. We agree with that completely. Our concern is moving too much of the evidence from pre-market to post-market, because when we do that, it means that too many patients are subject to drugs or devices that haven't been adequately proven to either work or to be safe, or to be nearly as good as other products on the market. Just to give you a visual of what substantially equivalent has sometimes meant in the past, these are two devices that were considered substantially equivalent for use in TMJ implants. As you can see, they look really different, and they're made from completely different materials. Here's a spinal system, again, two different devices that look completely different, and yet with modified parts and a newer complex system that was not tested in clinical trials. And then there's apples and oranges, which obviously would be considered substantially equivalent since they're both fruit and both nutritious, but we do have an expression about comparing them. The one other thing I just wanted to mention in response is that the new proposal for the Center for Devices for their more expedited review was urged to meet only for devices that meet urgent unmet needs. And I think all of us can be very sympathetic. If somebody has a urgent unmet need and there's no treatment for them, then they might be willing to take very scary risks that otherwise no patient would take.
We're gonna have
But
to wrap up.
yes, I promise. So my last point is that one of the examples that the FDA gave of an urgent unmet need, of a device for an urgent unmet need, was a device to help people with diabetes. I don't think diabetes is an urgent unmet need. This was a device that could help with more frequent glucose readings, but I don't think most people would consider that an urgent unmet need. So again, devil in the details, a lot of desire to get drugs and devices to market more quickly, but how important it is to make sure they're adequately tested first. Thank you.